Hi, I'm Gal. I'm the Chief Innovation and Product Officer at PlainID, and I'm going to speak with you today about data access controls for the business owners. Now, first of all, just before we start, let's see what this discussion is going to be focused about. I'm going to start by speaking about the challenge. Whenever I say business data access control for the business owners, I think, first of all, we need to understand what is the challenge with data access controls and why are we saying this is a business challenge, okay? So that's going to be the first part of this presentation. And then we'll speak about the need. Is there a need? Why is there a need? And what do we want to solve? I'm going to use some use cases to make this more understandable. And then a bit more to consider, because it's not just about setting those business controls, it's also how are we going to efficiently manage those controls, right? So I'm going to speak about those and then a bit of conclusion. So let's start. We'll start by understanding the challenge. Now, just to give the perspective of this session and why I'm speaking about the challenge of data access controls, because if we look at the overall identity and access management landscape, that's why we're all here, right? So we know it is typically divided to identity lifecycle, authentication, which is proving that identity. So many solutions in that area, right? And then the last part, the missing gap, is authorization. Connecting identities to data, connecting identities to functionality. We consider that, and I believe you would see some of the analysts are doing just the same as the missing gap in the identity and access management market. Because till now, the technology, the solutions were focusing around identity management, authentication, but not what happens after. You open the door to the application. What's the next step? What I can do? What can I see? Okay? And this is the discussion we are now having. So let's look at the challenge. Oh. Okay, so I chose this to represent the data, our assets. What do we want to protect, right? We each have our own assets. Those can be financial records, those can be account data, IT resources, workflow objects, communication records, whatever. Whatever your assets are, whatever your applications are enabling access to, those would be the assets you want to protect or you want to enable access. So this is a kind of a representation, visual representation. Now, within those assets, we have all types of pieces and bits. Now, who should gain access to our assets? Maybe our marketing department, maybe our IT, maybe financial. So we have different personas who would require access to those assets. What can each see? What can each do? This is the question. This is our challenge. That's what we are trying to solve. How do we connect identities to data? How do we connect identities to functionality? Not just how do we connect, how do we define that connection? So let's go to the graphics to explain that. So the challenge at hand is, one side we have our identities personas. On the other side we have assets, whatever assets those are. Data records, financial records, accounts data. Anything, you need to translate that into what you have in your applications, what you have in your organizations. Now, this is the question we are trying to solve. We are trying to fill in that gap. How to make that connection, how to define that efficiently. Remember, we also need to manage that. We also need to certify that, to govern, right? So it needs to be an efficient process. It needs to be an efficient definition. Not only we need to define that connection, there are also additions. It's not only how to define the connection, but what else can we do? I can see financial records. I can approve a money transaction. I can update a patient record. So what are the associated actions with what I want to enable access to, right? Also, are there conditions we want to add to that access. I can only approve money transactions from the US. If I'm in Europe, can't do that, right? I might not been able to even view some of the data or access some of the functionality from specific places at a specific time. If there is some kind of event, let's say there is a risk-based event, I want to enable access, I want to block access, okay? So answering that question, what can identities do within my applications, has some conditions to it, has some additional considerations which we need to take into account. This we call the access policy. Connecting identities to data and functionality is what we consider as the access policy. Now, let's understand how to build this access policy. The first part of the access policy are our identities. Our identities can be our employees, can be our partners, external users, system accounts, wearables, whatever. Any digital identity that operates within your digital landscape is an identity that we want to enable access to, we want to authorize, right? So what do we know about them? That's the second question. What do we know about each and every one of those identities? Well, a whole bunch of stuff, right? We know about our employees, their job title, we know their department, maybe their certification level. If those are our partners, we also know a lot of things, a lot of attributes about them, right? Also for system accounts. So this is the second question. What do we know about them? Now, after answering those two questions, then we can start describing them. How best to describe our identities? So who are the developers? Developers are all those with the title developer. Who are our European account managers? All those from Europe with the title account manager, right? So those are just simple examples, but you can take that to represent any of the examples in your organization. Eventually, going through that process, you define who are your digital identities, what do you know about them. By the way, you don't have to think what you have already defined, but what you know about them can be distributed in many places. I'm not talking about technology now, right? This is a concept to define efficient policies. So who are our identities? What do we know about them? And based on what we know about them, how do we categorize them? How do we best define them? And those would be what we call dynamic groups. Dynamic groups, identity rules, whatever. The market uses different terminology just to describe that. Grouping of identities based on their attributes, based on how they are defined. By the way, roles also play a part here. So roles is another way to describe identities. If we don't have something already describing them, we can describe them using roles. Okay, I'll speak more about that as we move along. But eventually, we'll get to a set of definitions of our identities. This is what we call the policy building blocks. This is just the one part, right? We'll cover all those different building blocks. But the identity building blocks are the way which we can describe our identities. By the way, individual identities can also participate. We don't want really to do that. It's less efficient, but it's there. Okay, it's there. Sometimes we need exceptions. We need to assign to individuals. So as part of our building blocks, we have dynamic groupings, we have roles, and we have individual identities. This is the first step to build a policy, the way which we see our identities. Some samples, those are samples from the PlainID product, a way to define dynamic grouping. You can see that the example I'm currently showing, New York-based accountants, takes into account the title and the region of the identities. And note that it's not a static assignment, right? Whenever we talk about dynamic grouping, not static assignment as we are used to with the role-based approach, but rather dynamic assignment of identities, not assignment, it's not even the right word, dynamic relationship, let's say, between the identities to the role. So if a new user onboards or changes their title or gets assigned, he would automatically fit into the policy. I don't need to do a manual operation in order for that to happen. It's been done automatically because it's dynamic assignment. Okay, so those are just some examples. Now let's move to the second one. Yeah, the second one are the assets. Remember, what do we want to enable access to? Those would be our financial records, accounts data, IT resources, whatever your applications are enabling users to do and see. Now, there are some examples here. What do we know about each and every one of those assets? Well, also a bunch of attributes. If this is an account record, we know maybe the type of the record. We know the associated amount with the record. Maybe the origin of the record, right? You have a set of attributes, set of characteristics associated with each and every one of those assets. And now we can use that in order to define our building blocks. The dynamic grouping, we call that dynamic containers, but again, whatever you choose, grouping dynamic containers of those assets. All of the, let's say, all of the financial records that are from the US, that's one grouping. All of the commercial accounts, that's grouping, okay? Again, it's dynamic grouping. I'm not assigning that statically, but rather whenever there is a new asset with the relevant attributes, it would automatically fit into that, okay? And also in this case, we can either group them dynamically or we can assign individual assets to be used in the policies. So now we have our building blocks for the identities. We have our building blocks for the assets. And next are the conditions. Oh, those are just some examples of building blocks of assets. So we can see UK-based accounts are all the accounts that are active, tagged as basic, and they are from the UK. Or unclassified marketing data, or the data which is tagged as marketing and it's not classified. Okay, those are samples of how would you group dynamically your assets, your data, and so on. And after we have defined our building blocks for conditions, the identities, building blocks for the assets, now we can speak about the conditions. What are the conditions? All the conditions which we want to add to the policy in order to restrict or to limit the access. So only during, only from office or only during working days, we can add any type of condition that we want, right? So think about all the environmental conditions which you would want to apply to accessing your applications, accessing your data, accessing and operating within the application. Again, if I would take an example from the authentication world, till now you could have done that only to open the door to the application. I can enable access from the US and block from maybe some other areas, but only to open the door to the application. Access policies enable you to do that within the application. Okay, so for example, you can say access to the application is enabled from everywhere, but the ability to operate within the application is limited based on location, based on time, based on whatever you want. Okay, so this kind of approach enables you to go deeper into the application with the levels of controls you can assign. So eventually, we are taking all those building blocks combined together in order to set our access policies, starting with the identity building blocks. Okay, based on identity building blocks, we can define the who part of the question. Then we are using the asset building blocks to define the what part of the question. And then we are using the conditions to define the when part of the question. And as you can see, all that leads to the basic authorization question. Who can do what and when? This is the authorization question. This is what we are trying to solve. Whenever we say we want to place data access controls, it is in order to answer this basic question, connecting our identities to data and functionality. Okay? So this is an example of a visual representation of a policy. Again, this example is taken from the PlainID product. We believe that presenting the decision in a visual representation, visual graph, describes best that type of access and also takes into account the different dimensions of that type of access. As you can see very clearly, who can do what and when is described in that type of representation. Okay. Next, we are going to speak about the need for access controls. Why do we need access controls, and what should we consider when we want to start defining our access controls? So first of all, I believe you are here because you know access controls is needed, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't be in such a session. I think the market also has advanced to a point where there is a very strong understanding. We need access controls, data access controls. It's not enough to have authentication in place. It's not enough just to open the door. Okay, you need also to place controls within the application in order to determine what users can do once the door is opened. Okay, and I think this is something which is beginning to be much a stronger initiative in the market. I think a lot of that is coming also from all kinds of privacy controls, and not only internal controls within the organization. So what are the main issues? What are the main issues you are facing today whenever you want to set those controls? Why can't you do that efficiently today? Okay, that's basically the questions. I think, first of all, the first issue is that all of the solutions till now were very technical. So you had to hand it to your IT. There was the IT department, and they set the controls. Can you see that? Can you control that? Do you know what's happening there? Yes, you can ask for all those huge reports, and that's what you would get from your IT, right? All the groups in Active Directory associated with a specific user. This is my access controls. That's what I can see. Is that good enough? Well, you need to answer that question. But till now, access control was in the hands of the IT, and that was one of the problems. The second problem is that we didn't have sufficient controls. Why? Because most of the controls till now were coarse-grained. Okay? The difference between coarse-grained to fine-grained is that coarse-grained defines main functionality. Fine-grained can take you into that functionality and into the data. Okay? So I can say that I'm a developer, right? I am a developer, and I can do a whole bunch of stuff. Or I can say that I have the ability to update specific projects' development specs, and only before they are approved, for example. Okay, so this is kind of a difference between coarse-grained and fine-grained. Most of the technologies till now were very coarse-grained. Why? Because they are very related to authentication. Okay, so those are the two main issues. Now let's see how we can address that. The way to address that is, if the slide, okay. The way to address that efficiently is using the policy-based access control approach. Again, we are speaking about access controls to data access controls, and the way to do that efficiently is using the policy-based concept. I believe you have heard about policy-based multiple times. This is a new kind of let's call it trend in the market. We used to hear about role-based access control and then attribute-based access control, so different methods. Each has their own advantages, but also disadvantages. Policy-based access control is a new method that combines the both. It takes both roles and attributes, enabling a more efficient way to control access to your data, to your assets. Now, what's so different about policy-based access control? First of all, the perspective of view. I'll explain what it means. Okay, I'm going to explain each and every one of those. Second, it provides consistent answer to different questions. Why do we need that, and what does it mean? Again, we'll see that. Third, it is designed for the business, right? We said access control, data access controls is a business question, not a technical question. So we need a solution that can address also the business, not just the technology. And of course, it answers adaptive and fine-grained questions. So let's start with perspective of view. In order to understand that, I'm going to use an example. I'm going to use an example of the medical record. So again, I'm using this to represent assets. I have all kinds of medical records, different kinds and different data within that medical records. And who should have access to those medical records? Well, okay, so different doctors and nurses, they need access to those medical records. What can each do with the medical record? Well, each can see different records and each can do different operations with those medical records. So let's see that. Okay, so those are some sample policies. A doctor can access his patient full medical records. If this is my patient, if this is my patient, I can see everything. I can see basic data, I can see private data, and so on, because this is my patient, but only if it's my patient, okay? That's a sample policy. But I can, if I am a doctor, I can also see the general data of all patients. Why? Because this can be potentially my patient. So if I'm looking at a data record, a patient record, it has different sections to it. It has general data about the patient. It has very specific, maybe personal data for the patient. And I want to enable access to parts of that data. So this is what my policy would represent. It would represent the ability to access all of the data or parts of the data based on who the user is, his relationship to the patient, and the level of expertise the doctor of the doctor or of the nurse. So you can see those are some sample policies I would like to build on that data. Okay, those are some of the things I would like to achieve. So I say the first thing which is different about policies is the perspective of view. Looking back at those policies, I can approach the question from different perspective. I can look at a doctor and ask, okay, what can this doctor do? What can this nurse do? This is, as you know, this is the role-based approach. So if you are utilizing today the role-based approach, then you probably know the complexity involved in building so many roles, right? You're familiar with that, I see. Some of you are nodding, which is great. You're familiar with that. We need roles, right? But we can't take that all the way because it's so complex. It leads to role explosion. The same question we can address from a different perspective. We can see what are the similarities in the access patterns. Some need to access general data. Some need to access private data, right? And then we can create less controls, more efficient controls. So using just the identity perspective to analyze our decision, leads to role explosion. But using the data perspective can provide you a much more focused controls that would lead to reduction in the amount of decisions that you would eventually need to govern, you need to certify, you need to manage. Okay, so one main differentiation between existing methods to the policy, one of the main differentiation policy-based approach brings to the table is the perspective of view. It looks at the challenge from what is being accessed and what is common from those decisions. What is common from what is needed to be accessed, and not what is common from the identities that need to access. Okay, you can think of several examples that you have today. If you have carried out the role-based method or in the process, and think about how that can possibly make the process more efficient, setting up controls to what you currently have. I think this is an interesting case to consider. I can share with you that we have done that multiple times, and in all cases, you can see how you can reduce the amount of decisions eventually that you have in place. Okay, so perspective of view, that's one thing. Second, the authorization question. I want to speak about the authorization question. I think this is also something which is important to understand. So the very basic question is, can I do something, right, and get a yes, no? So can user A see asset B? This is a financial record, a medical record. Can I see that? Can I approve that? Can I modify that? And the answer is yes, no. Very basic authorization question. That's how authorizations were always handled. Whenever I want to set a control on something, the control is, can I do that? Yes, no. Okay? Now, this has advantages because it's very clear, very direct. However, it also has a lot of disadvantages. It has disadvantages because not all technologies can use this type of question. Now, think again about the current applications and technologies which you have in place. Do you have search engines? Do you have BI reports? Do you have databases? Do you have data portals? Do you have specific homegrown applications that are looking at the same type of assets, the same type of data, possibly the same type of functionality? Now, not all can ask the same question, but all should get the same type of answer. And that's what policies, again, bring to the table. I can ask all of those questions, I'm going to explain in a second, all of those questions to the same policies. I don't have to build different controls. I want consistent answers to those different questions coming from different perspectives. So my first question is about a user, an asset, and an action, and I want to get a yes, no. My second question is just about the user. What can this user do? This user can do A, B, and C. That's what this user can do. It is in line with the first question. Then I can also ask about an asset. Okay, for this financial record, who can access this financial record? Again, consistent with previous questions I was asking. And the last part is what we call policy resolution. Okay, so for this user, what are the specific controls now, which now I want to apply? Okay, so think about a SQL query, right? Think about a SQL query. I want now to search within my repositories. And I want to set the appropriate controls for that type of search. They have to be consistent with all the previous questions and answers I got. This is what the policy resolution is. It's kind of the workflows of my SQL query. Okay, and it is in line with all the previous controls. If we want to see some samples with the doctor use case, so I would ask, can Dr. Albert see Emily's medical records? Yes, he's her doctor, so yes, he can see that. And the second question is now, Dr. Albert is searching in the medical archive. What can he see? So he can see Emily's medical record, but also other patients' medical records. Consistent answers all the way. And if I want to understand, okay, from even maybe from governance perspective, who can see Emily's medical records? So of course, Dr. Albert, again, consistent with all the previous questions, and also Dr. Stone. So you see how the policy, which we have set in place, provides same answers over and over, would address different application patterns as we move along with that type of approach. Okay? Design for the business. So how does your current authorization look like? When you want to set authorizations in place, when you want to set those controls, how does that look like? Can you see the access decisions? Can you understand what is being enforced on the current access which you have in place? I assume some of what you have looks like this. One of them is Active Directory, and the second is XACML. Just took some examples. But again, very, very technical. The current solutions in place are very, very technical. And as I said before, data access controls should be for the business. They should enable the business to see and to get their control. They can't be like this. Okay, I once went into a presentation where it was a presentation to business owners, and they saw something like this, and they said, okay, no way, go away. So instead, we brought something like this, and they were much more happy. The decisions have to be visible. They have to be understandable. Even if they're not managing that just by themselves, they need the ability to investigate and to understand the logic behind the controls which are set in place. Okay, so the tools today, we can see that the tools in the market are being more designed for the business owners, not just for the technology. Let's build a policy together, okay? Let's see how that goes. So we are going to build a policy that would enable us to view commercial accounts. Of course, this is a sample, access personal medical info. This is a policy, a sample policy from the PlainID product. I'm also going to use the walkthrough wizard in order to show you how that is done. You can see that the wizard takes you through the process of who can do what and when. Those are the building blocks. That's what we need to do. We need to define that very efficiently and consistently. So the first thing is the who. Who are our identities? I'm just picking and choosing. Remember those building blocks? I have them in place. The IT took care of that for me. So I just need to pick and choose from those building blocks. Next step are the conditions. What are the conditions I want to set in place? Time, location, and so on. And the last part are the assets. What are the assets which I want to use? Again, I'm going to use medical records-based assets and just picking and choosing from those building blocks which I mentioned previously. So the process of building a policy is smooth and easy to understand. You can see those building blocks are preset for me by the technology. I'm just choosing whatever I want, whatever filters I want. Of course, there is a whole lot of technology behind that, but we just need to set a policy. So personal patient data and doctor areas of expertise, those are the filtering that I'm choosing for my policy. And that's it. Look, I finished building a policy in like less than, I don't know, 15 seconds. That's how long it took me to build this policy. Now, it's not enough just to build a policy, right? I want to understand what is the impact of that policy. What stands behind this policy? Who are the users who are actually impacted by this policy? So again, a policy tool, an advanced policy, would enable you to do that, would enable you to get that visibility, both into the decision which you have defined and also to the impact of the policy. Look, the identities. Those are the, I just built the policy, I want to see who that affects. Those are the identities. It's all there. And that leads us to more to consider. Okay, so we understood we need policies because they are efficient and they provide better control over our data, over the functionality in our applications, in our platforms. So we have that covered. We also understood how to build that policy efficiently. We have the building blocks, identity, asset, conditions. So what else do we need to consider? Is it just enough to build those policies? No. We also need to manage them. We need to manage them in an efficient way. Remember, you are all, I guess, representing different levels of organizations, enterprises. You can't just build a policy and then start working with that policy. We need to consider several things. So what do we need to consider? First of all, we need a tool that can support our internal processes. Going through development all the way to production has several steps in the way, right? You're familiar with that. So first of all, you need a life cycle management. You need a solution that would support that type of approach. Think about a development process, right? In a development process, you start in development, you test, you approve, and then you deploy in higher environment. Same thing with policies. Policy is not a single assignment. It has a wider effect. That's why you need a life cycle that would support that. Start by building the policies, testing the policies, and then go through an approval process in order to approve them. This is important. Second, the workflows. You need workflows that can define what's the path to deploy the policies. Maybe you want to manage different controls. You have different levels of applications. You have finance applications, HR-related applications, customer-facing, internal-facing, whatever. And some would require one path of approval, and some would require a different. So you need that flexibility to configure that by yourself to manage each and every type of policies the way they should be. Okay? You don't want to set too much controls. Another aspect which I believe not always gets the right attention, but it's important, delegation of administration. So think about the current identity and access management tool that you have in place. Who's managing? Who's the admin of those tools? 1 group, 2 groups, 10 groups? Can you do that? Can you delegate some of those capabilities to other groups within your organization? Do you want to do that? If you do, then you need a solution for delegation. Okay? In this area, when we have complexity, we have many definitions which we want to manage, it can't be always in the hands of a single group. Some definitions are more IT-related, some are more business-related. Those who are responsible for the finance policies are not always the ones responsible for the IT policies. So you might want to delegate that to different groups within your organization. So you need a tool that would support that. Remember, delegation of administrative rights makes the management process more efficient. Whenever you're looking for a solution in some area, it's not only what the solution can do, but also how it can do it. And those are just things to consider. Version control. Again, think about policies the way as you would think of a code. You want to go back. You want to understand what happened in the past, who changed things. you need version control. The policies would develop over time, and you need a tool that would support that type of development. Analytic and reports. I think this is also a very important, not always taken care aspect of a solution. Okay, so we are building policies. What is the effect of the policies? I just showed a very small part of that. What's the effect of the policies? What would happen if we change something? How many times did you come across a situation where HR chose to change the organizational structure? And what happened to authorization? Did you come across that situation? Yeah, okay. So you want to predict things in advance. What would happen if? Ask those type of questions. Have the ability to ask those type of questions, okay? So analytic of both what you have in place and also predict what can happen if changes are occurring. So those are some considerations you should take into account. I have some samples here, and I also have time to show it. So I'm going to show you some examples. This is one example where you can investigate your policy. You can understand who are the identities of the policy, and you can also understand the full association of a single dynamic grouping. So account managers, who are those account managers? We can see the users and also all the policies associated with an account manager. Just change the focus of our perspective. Now you can see why we chose this graphical representation, and now I can see the same decision from different perspective. Okay, so I'm changing my point of view. So this is one thing. Okay. Second is the ability to investigate into those access decisions. And sorry, I'm having some challenges with the clickable. Okay, so let's investigate into our policies. Whenever we want to investigate into our policies, we can do that also from multiple perspectives. We want to understand what's happening and what's the current impact of our existing policies. So this is an example where we investigate from an identity perspective. I'm going to use a single identity just as a sample, okay? So I'm going to pull that identity, and immediately you can see on the left side of the screen all the attributes that are currently associated with this identity. Now let's investigate. Once we investigate, we can see the full set of policies associated with those set of attributes. Not only the policies, but also note the applications, resources, and actions. You kind of get an end-to-end view into the impact of those policies. Also, when you choose any single policy, you can see the identities associated with that policy and all the path into the application, the assets and the actions associated with that policy which you chose. Now remember the what if I spoke before. Note that all those attributes are clickable. Now I can change them. This user was a manager. What would happen if now he will be a developer? What would happen if he would change a department? I can see how that would affect the current access control on that type of user. Okay, so this is kind of a small taste of what an analytic tool should provide you. Insights to what you currently have in place, and also what-if questions, ability to answer the what-if questions. Lifecycle management, I spoke about that. So policies should be built in a a studio environment where you can test them, you can analyze them, and then send them in through an approval before they are deployed in higher environment. Again, let's see a bit of that. So a bit of the life cycle. Okay, so first of all, remember I mentioned that workflows can be defined for different types of policies. In the PlainID terminology, we call that namespaces. Namespaces are management areas for policies. So you can have multiple management areas, each having their own workflow process. Now we can see that we are configuring a workflow process that is based on two paths. One, a security path, a second one, a management path for approvals. You can set who are the specific identities or roles of identities that would participate in that approval process. And once this is set, it needs to be set only once per each of those management areas. Now each policy, once you build it, can go through an approval process. So let's send a policy to an approval process. Once the policy is sent for approval, you can add, of course, comments. You can see the full request details. So it's a simple workflow process that enables you to approve your policies. You can also choose where you want those policies to be deployed. Okay. By the way, this type of process would enable you also to involve the different stakeholders within the organization who needs to be involved in approving policies, and also to take that into their attention. This is something which we are currently doing, and we want to approve that. I want to move a bit fast forward here because I think we are out of time. I'm just skipping some of those. I spoke about version control. Delegation of administrative rights is the ability to define different management areas and provide each with the different abilities that you want. Of course, this can be hierarchical. I just want to get to this last slide, okay? My key takeaways for this session. First of all, the market has evolved a lot, right? You are familiar of the different ways to address this issue. Again, the issue we started with is data access controls for business owners. And there was a lot of development in the market. I think this is like the last part which needs to be handled after identity lifecycle was handled, authentication, and now this one, authorization. And we see the development from role-based, attribute-based, and what we now see is the policy-based approach. Policy-based approach is currently known as the most efficient way to manage controls for your data and functionality. So this is one thing to consider. If you are looking to advance in this area, you should look for a tool that can provide such capability. Second, we also see that responsibility shifts from IT to business owners because of many different considerations, because of regulations that are now in place, and they are putting responsibility on the business owners, no longer just the IT. Okay, how many of you do have privacy officers now in your organizations? It means you're taking responsibility for access and placing that on the business owner. If such a thing happens, then they need tools. They need tools that can support that type of responsibility. Okay, so we see that, and we see that in different areas, not just regulations. Analytic is important part. You can't just define those policies or set those controls and then what? What happens? What do we understand? So you need to have some analytic capabilities that would provide better insights. And the last thing is, whenever you are considering something like that, whenever you're considering to move forward with a solution that will give you better control, don't look just on what you have now, but also what would come. Why? Because this is an evolving area. Today you can say that, I'm just using some of the terms here. So today you might say, SAML, good enough for me. OpenID Connect, that's all I need. Active Directory, wow. But what happens tomorrow? What happens when you, let's say, migrate to the cloud, if you haven't done that already? And what happens when you start using some newer technologies? Those are advancing hand in hand, right? Today, security groups, Active Directory is the most common method used. That's what you have most probably now. But moving forward, it would change. It would change and it would adapt. So a solution should be able to address now and also tomorrow. So that's it. Yeah. Thank you.